Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Lovely to see you on this summer's evening, and welcome to a very special event here at the London home of the Brahmakumaris. Yoga, the practice and the science. And we're in for a real treat this evening. We've got a very special guest from the United States, Professor Sat Bir Singh Khalsa. Who's going to share with us many jewels, I'm sure, and I'll introduce a little later more on him. But just to ask you very briefly, is anyone here for the first time to this venue? Good evening, lovely to see you. So most of you are familiar with the Brahma Kumaris. The Brahma Kumaris are co-hosting this event this evening with the Janki Foundation. The Brahma Kumaris UK provides opportunities for people from all religious and cultural backgrounds, as you probably know, to explore their spirituality and learn skills, reflection and meditation derived from the practice of Raja Yoga, which is a meditation practice. And it's a charity established in 1975. And it's now a community of organisations spread throughout the world in over 100 countries. The Janki Foundation, who's collaborating for this event, is a UK charity promoting spirituality, specifically in healthcare. And the foundation acknowledges the central role of positive thoughts and feelings, compassion and kindness, in particular in maintaining well-being and preventing illness. And through publications, through experiential learning, talks and networking, the foundation provides opportunities to further such approaches among individuals and professionals. So these are the two organisations who are hosting this evening, for those who don't know us. I've been asked to just find out how you might have heard of this event tonight, whether it was through friends, if anyone could have a show of hands. If it was through friends, thank you. If it was through the web, one, okay, or maybe you knew us already. I think quite a few people are today. We are also being streamed live. There is a live webcast, so I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to you all out there in cyberspace. Fantastic that you're joining us this evening for this special program. Okay, so just before I introduce Professor Sat Bir Singh Khalsa, I would just like to mention a few housekeeping points. And the first one is please put your mobiles onto silent. If you've got it with you, that would be wonderful, thank you. And also, if the fire alarm does go off, there are ushers with purple sashes who will guide the way. So just that. And also, it is being live webcast. It is being filmed from the webcast. So just to let you know that. But you won't be filmed. The speakers will be filmed. So just to reassure you on that one. Okay, so our guest speaker, all the way from the US, who we're really delighted to welcome here tonight. He's going to be sharing on a topic that he has investigated and instructed on for many, many years. His biodata is really prolific. I was reading through it, and here we have some of his titles. He is the Assistant Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's the Director of Research at the Kundalini Research Institute. He's the Research Director at Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, the Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, and a Research Associate at the Benson Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine. So we can see the sort of level of interest and investigation that we're going to be listening to tonight. We're looking forward to hearing how Professor Khalsa will share how science and biomedical research now support the idea that yoga is truly a practice for modern society And he's going to present this evening an overview of the practice of yoga and make a case for its contribution to wellness and modern healthcare, as he covers the psychophysiological benefits of yoga. He will also share how traditional yoga is more than physical exercise. So I bet there's some practitioners here who would probably put their hands up to that. More than physical exercise, and how most of his research is on the contemplative forms of yoga practice that include meditation. So I'd love to invite now Professor Khalsa to take the stage. Thank you.
Very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Janki Foundation and Brahma Kumaris UK for this kind introduction to an invitation to share what I have to say. I've been practicing yoga myself since 1971, and I have been actively doing yoga research since 2001, and I've had the opportunity to travel internationally, attend all of the yoga research conferences, and run them myself. So I'd like to share with you a sort of a global perspective of where we are with the practice and the science of yoga in modern society and the implications of that for society and for health and health care. But before we start, and perhaps we can pull this USB connector out and put it back in so that we can readjust this so that I can move the slides. So the first thing we want to do is really talk about what we mean by the word yoga and the word yoga therapy. And I think that's important because yoga has become very popular, as I'm going to share with you, and the word yoga means many different things to many different people. And I'm going to start with a definition that my yoga teacher, Yogi Bhajan, has given. He said, yoga teaches you the techniques and awareness to stay healthy. You gain strong immune, glandular, and nervous systems. This foundation gives you energy and lets you deal with the mental and spiritual facets of your life. And this is a very modern definition of yoga that many people embrace yoga for. And a lot of the research really that I'm going to share with you really does address a lot of these issues about the nervous system and how it changes with yoga practice. So let's talk about a definition of yoga. And for some people, yoga is just the physical postures and the exercises that you see displayed here. They are very unique and different from Western exercises. However, when I'm talking about yoga for the purposes of this talk, what I'm really referring to is traditional yoga practice. And traditional yoga practice incorporates not just the physical postures and exercises, although almost all of them do, but in addition to that, there are other important components. One of these are the breathing exercises, or the so-called pranayama practices. Another one is the deep relaxation techniques that are involved, usually at the end of a yoga class. And then there's meditation, or the mindfulness component, the control of attention. And in fact, many of us in science and academics that work with yoga really believe that it's really meditation which is the key practice here. And in fact, in many cases, we believe that these other physical components are there to support this meditative component of yoga practice. So my definition of yoga is really as a contemplative practice. And it's a multi-component practice incorporating all of these components. And most of my research colleagues view yoga in the same way. So let's talk about yoga a little bit in terms of popularity. I think this popularity is now growing dramatically, and we're seeing this as an international movement. At the top is Swami Ramdev, who's become very popular in India. He teaches to tens of thousands of people at a time, and that popularity is growing. This is the largest yoga center in Europe and Germany, and this is a Yoga Day in Portugal. But the Prime Minister of India recently addressed the United Nations, and in that address he made 3 points. The first point he made was that yoga is basically a holistic practice. It's not just postures, it's deeper than that. The second point he made in his address was that yoga is applicable for modern science because of the epidemic of so-called lifestyle medicine that's occurring in modern society, and that yoga is very applicable for that. And then the final thing he made a motion for was to adopt an International Day of Yoga. So accordingly, in December of 2014, the United Nations proclaimed that June 21st, the summer solstice, was the International Day of Yoga. And so this has been celebrated internationally. And this is Prime Minister Modi in India on June 21st, 2015. And you can see many people practicing with him, but you don't get a sense of the extent of that until you see the aerial view, which is here. He had 35,000 people celebrating International Day of Yoga with him. And of course, this was International Day of Yoga, so this is Paris, France. This is the base of the Eiffel Tower. This is China. They're very organized in China. And of course, London. And this is the website that was up for the International Day of Yoga, which took place at Alexandra Palace. And here's a photograph of the folks practicing and celebrating International Day of Yoga here in London. And in terms of the popularity of yoga and the statistics, what we have mostly has been done in the United States, where a lot of the epidemiological surveys are being done. And this slide shows you the survey that was conducted and released in January of this year. It was conducted by two organizations, the Yoga Alliance and the Yoga Journal, which are two sort of leading organizations in yoga. And what this survey found was that as of 2012, 36 million, actually as of 2015, 36 million Americans are actively practicing yoga, which is a staggering number. And in addition to that, they asked on the survey, for those people not practicing, do you have any interest in practicing of any kind? That was an additional 83 million individuals. So not only is yoga popular, that popularity is growing. And on the next slide, which is playing with us, you can see the trend that's happened over the years. And believe me when I tell you that it started at 15.8 million, went up to 20 million a number of years later, and then there was a jump from 2012 to 2016 of almost 100%. So you can see this trend in the popularity of yoga. Now, this was a survey done by a non-scientific group. However, we have survey results from our Center for Disease Control, and our National Institutes of Health, which of course are federal agencies. And those statistics indicate that we are now at 10% of the population. So that's a staggering number in terms of what we see in terms of the popularity of yoga. 10% of the population doing anything is staggering. So here's this jump from 6% to 10%. This is a 50% increase over the course of 5 years. Now this was, of course, 4 years ago. So it's like we were already over 10% of the population practicing yoga. And now I've lost my advancer. Oh, it's advancing there. Sorry for these technical problems. So we also have a survey that was done in the UK, although this was not completed until 2008. And what that corroborates is, in fact, from this quote from the paper, there was a significant increasing trend of yoga practice from 1997 to 2008. So we're seeing this not just in the US, but certainly here in the UK and globally. Now, if you see those kinds of statistics, those kinds of numbers, you would expect to see the evidence in the culture, and we do see that. So this is a cover of a popular US magazine, Life. This caption reads, "Dogs do it, kids do it, even desperate housewives do it." Why we've become a yoga nation. And of course, this is an actress who's playing in the television series Desperate Housewives. And then much earlier, this is a picture of a Time magazine cover, The Science of Yoga. This is model Christy Turlington doing a posture I plan never to do. And this is one of the negatives about the media with respect to yoga, because this is what they portray yoga is. And that idea is that you have to be flexible in order to practice yoga, and it's practiced by rich, middle-aged, thin women in leotards. And of course, the elderly, young children, they look at this and they say, I can't do that. And that's a misconception about yoga practice, because yoga practices or elements of yoga practice can be practiced by any element of the population, including patient populations, which I'm going to discuss a little later. Now, that popularity is growing for a number of years. Before International Day of Yoga, New York Times Square on June 21st spent the entire day taking over New York Times Square with yoga practice. This is an international icon. 15,000 people register to practice yoga on New York Times Square. These are stunning photographs. This I just picked up off the internet. This is from a blog that now says that there are 9 airports where there are yoga rooms installed. This number is growing. Most of these are in the US, so these are 5 airports in the US. These are not small airports. This is San Francisco International, Chicago O'Hare, Dallas Fort Worth. These are major airports that now have yoga rooms where you can practice yoga. And don't feel left out. Both London Heathrow and London Gatwick have yoga rooms. So there you have it. Anything that becomes popular in society, the advertising industry knows about. And they use that knowledge to sell products. And if the view of yoga is something that's healthful for you, they can use that to sell products that have somewhat of a negative connotation. So here they're selling vodka. This is a vodka bottle doing a headstand on a yoga mat. And here on the right, they're selling you a sleeping pill, an over-the-counter sleeping pill with a yoga posture, claiming that if you take their sleeping pill, you'll be rested in the morning and more willing to do your yoga. So it's a little bit odd sometimes when you see these, but there it is. And of course, you know you've hit the big time when a big corporation like McDonald's is using you. So this was a program they had a few years ago offering a yoga DVD, and on a fruit and yogurt cup, when I picked one up, there was somebody practicing yoga on my cup. And this is a full-page ad in Newsweek magazine, a news magazine that's very popular in the US. And this caption reads, "I do yoga in my suite, doctor's orders," introducing this construct of people using yoga as a therapeutic intervention for medical conditions. Now, yoga was not traditionally, originally a form of medicine. It was a practice for the development of inner growth and health. And the idea of using yoga for therapy began at the beginning of the 20th century. And it became very popular in India. And in fact, in 1963, the Indian government commissioned this book called Yoga Therapy. So this is 1963 by a leader in the field. And that became very popular in India, continued to grow. It came to the West just like yoga did. So now we have many, many books on yoga therapy and many yoga therapy practitioners. One of these books is Yoga as Medicine by my colleague Timothy McCall. And you can see the evidence of that therapeutic application of yoga in the media as well. So this is another cover of Time magazine. The caption here reads, "How your mind can heal your body." So it has become very popular as well. So now I want to turn my attention to what we know about the psychophysiology of yoga. And a lot of this is covered in an ebook that I have written for the general public. Now, ordinarily, I would not want to write a book for the general public, but this was an invitation from Harvard Health Publications. And somehow I just could not turn down the opportunity to have a book in the world that had the Harvard Medical School logo, their name, and the word yoga on the same cover. It was just too much of a plum to deny. And I can tell you that my impression is that 20 years ago, this would have been inconceivable. So it's another sign of where yoga has come in terms of its implementation within society. And in fact, it's even gone further. Just about to be released is this book called An Introduction to Yoga. It's just about 50 pages long, but it's a Harvard Medical School special health report. And I served as the medical editor for this publication. So Harvard Medical School is promoting yoga practice. It's quite remarkable. The body of evidence looking at the effects of how yoga works on us, both mentally, emotionally, and physically, has grown substantially. In fact, that body of literature is so big now that there are review papers summarizing the mechanisms that underlie how yoga is working. So here we're talking about how does yoga reduce stress, talking about the mechanisms, the neurophysiological and neurocognitive mechanisms underlying yoga-based practices, a theoretical framework, and then here the self-regulatory nature of the mechanisms of yoga for psychological health. So this is a growing area of interest. Now, going back to the beginning, I think that this research on yoga mechanisms and how yoga works is really fairly recent. And this is one of the more key older studies that was published in the 1950s. And what these researchers did is they traveled all over India for a year, hunting down these advanced yoga practitioners to hook them up and see what was happening. What were they doing with their bodies and their minds? And the conclusion from this extensive study was that physiologically, yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system. So what does that mean? Well, the autonomic nervous system was named autonomic because it was believed to be automatic. You had no control over it. The autonomic nervous system is the main conveyor of information about emotion and about stress in the body. So essentially what this is introducing is this construct we call self-regulation, the ability of human beings to control their internal state. And that is a fundamental finding that underlies a lot of what we know about the mechanisms of yoga practice and has a lot of relevance for yoga as a therapeutic intervention. And of course, this control of the stress response is a key factor in terms of yoga's benefit. In fact, most of the studies that have been done with the practice of yoga have as an outcome the ability to improve stress regulation and chronic stress. And so this slide, which is trying to come back, is a review paper that has summarized a lot of the research studies that have been done on yoga's effects on stress. And in fact, not only is the research showing that, but of course this is one of the reasons that people are practicing yoga. And in this next slide, this is from a study that we conducted in Austin, Texas, where we asked beginners yoga students why they were coming to a beginner's yoga class. What was their reason for practicing yoga? Among the top three, there it is, stress management. And another finding is that there's also illness prevention, alleviating a health condition, and actually 5% said that their doctor had recommended that they practice yoga. So you can see that the reasons for yoga practice really involve stress in a big way, and that's a big finding, the central component of what yoga can do. Now, jumping forward to modern science, to the most recent technology, one of these techniques is called molecular biology. The advances in molecular biology are phenomenal these days. And it's happened with yoga practices as well. So the central dogma of molecular biology is that the genes, the DNA, makes transcripts, which makes ultimately proteins. And the proteins are the things that do things in the body. Now, you can't change your DNA. That's what you inherited from your parents. But modern science now knows that there are many control points at every level down here, down from the DNA, including the activity of your genes. So things can change activity of your genes. So for example, if you smoke cigarettes, you have more likelihood of turning on genes that will cause cancer. That's why people are saying you shouldn't smoke cigarettes, because you're making those genomic expression changes. So not only can you do bad things to your genes, turn on bad genes, you can turn on good genes and turn off bad genes by behaviors. And one of those behaviors that's been researched recently has been yoga. And so we see in this study here, this is a study conducted at UCLA. This was a yoga meditation called Kirtan Kriya. And what they did was they gave this meditation to people who were chronic, stressed caregivers of dementia patients. And what they found was that the yoga intervention changed genomic expression. What it did was upregulate gene activity that was good for you, in other words, immune function. Immune function genes were turned on, whereas genes that were involved in inflammation, which is not so good for you, those genes were turned off. So yoga has the ability to affect our cellular biology at the molecular level, at the genetic level. So this is a remarkable area of research, and we're going to start to see a lot of studies that are focusing on the ability of yoga practices to work at the cellular and molecular level. Now, another area of research that is very phenomenal and cutting edge is so-called neuroimaging. You could try that, but I'm not sure it's going to help. You want to pull that? I apologize for the technical difficulties. I think it's just the computer. So the other area that's at the cutting edge of science is so-called neuroimaging. These are techniques using large machines. And could you plug that back in? Then I can control the slides again. Is it? Okay, good. It's almost there. So this is the machine in the background you can hear. It's a very large machine. This is a Buddhist meditator. And what they're doing is they're going to put him in this machine. And this machine has the capability of looking at brain activity. And it can look down to very, very minute areas of the brain and determine which areas of the brain are changing activity with meditation. And you can look from second to second to second, so you can generate very precise maps of how the brain is working when people are meditating. So we're starting to understand how the brain works during meditation. And so this is an example of a type of study that's been done using long-term meditation practitioners. And what we see is that the activity of the brain in non-meditators is actually different from the activity of the brain in meditators. So when you meditate, you are focusing your attention on a target, and then you are stopping mind wandering. And that effect, that practice, is actually changing brain activity. You're activating the attention networks in the brain. You're shutting down other areas of the brain activity. And you can see these differences using these neuroimaging techniques. So this is a really fantastic area because we can see that, in fact, we are changing brain activity. Now, of course, for those of us who've been practicing yoga and meditation for years, it's like, duh. Of course the brain changes its activity. I'm experiencing these fantastic things. Something's changing in there. So these findings are not that, overwhelming. However, for modern science to be able to see objective evidence that indeed these practices are doing real changes, it's really good for convincing modern science that yoga has a real virtue. It's not just a hobby. It's not just the placebo effect. Now, another facet of brain activity is so-called brain plasticity. Your brain can change its structure over time. You know that when you do some pumping with iron and weights, you get big biceps. That's plasticity of your muscles. The more you exercise certain areas of the brain, there's more real estate devoted to those areas of the brain. And in fact, this is a study from our National Institutes of Health in the United States, and what they found in this study was that long-term yoga practitioners have higher cold pain tolerance than non-yoga practitioners. They tolerate pain better. Not only that, but the area of the brain that's involved in pain regulation is actually bigger in yoga practitioners. And that area of the brain increases in size directly proportional to the number of years that you've been practicing yoga. So as you practice yoga and meditation over a period of time, you are changing the structure of your brain. You're developing, essentially, a yoga and meditator's brain. And it's the same with any kind of behavioral activity. The more energy you devote to it, the more the brain adjusts by changing its brain structure and activity. Another phenomenon in the brain is cognitive function, how we function, our executive levels of functioning. There's an intelligence called fluid intelligence, which is a high level of intelligence. It's what makes us human. The ability to analyze, to think abstractly, identify patterns, solve problems, discern relationships. One of the things about being human is that you age, you've noticed. This is what happens with fluid intelligence over the course of age, from 40 to 70. You can see this decline in fluid intelligence. We're losing our ability to manifest this high level of intelligence. However, when we compare long-term yoga practitioners and long-term meditators, their traces are up here. They are not experiencing the same decline in cognitive function. So there's something about these practices that actually maintains cognitive functioning. It's like the fountain of youth, in a sense, for brain functioning. And it's not just the intelligence level, it's actually the brain functional architecture that's being maintained by these practices. So again, we're changing brain activity and brain structure over the long term. Now, of course, the definition of meditation is essentially the control of attention. Whether you're focusing on a single point or on a mantra or on the flow of thought or on the flow of sensation, the key feature is that you're controlling attention. What happens when you control your attention? Well, the mind stops wandering because you've focused your attention. So what is this, mind wandering and focus of attention? What's the difference? Well, we're studying meditation as we study the focus, but what is this mind wandering? Well, scientists are starting to look at what mind wandering is and the consequences of that. So this is a study conducted by a Harvard group, published in our premier biomedical journal, Science. And the conclusion from this study was that people's minds wandered frequently, regardless of what they were doing. Now, of course, we all already know this. But the interesting finding in this study was that people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not. So why is this the case? Well, if you look at the content of a lot of the thoughts that we have, they're negative in tone. They're survival thoughts. You're standing at the bus stop. What if the bus is late? Then I'm going to be late for my job. My boss is going to chew me out. And then my wife is going to be on my case. Oh my God, I can't see a taxi anywhere. And then we're going to have trouble here and here. And you know how it goes on. Now, each one of these little thoughts is not making you happy. It's a stressful thought. But that's the way your brain is creating elements for survival. And so the majority of thoughts are, in fact, in negative tone. So what happens when you focus your attention in meditation? It's a mind-wandering holiday. You're no longer focusing your attention. You're no longer allowing the mind to generate that kind of stuff. You're generating some degree of control by going into this neutral space where you're focusing your attention. And so science is now starting to show that people who meditate over the longer period of time, in fact, become at less risk for psychological disorders and mood disturbances because they're spending less time with that kind of mind wandering. And that people who spend more time 24/7 allowing their minds to wander are more at risk for mood disturbance and even psychological disorders. And this is highlighted very nicely in one neuroimaging study that was done. They put people in the scanner and they said meditate. And they gave them an event marker to tell them when they first noticed that their mind had wandered. So now they can image the brain when it's mind wandering and when the attention is focused. And when the attention is focused, in the focus phase, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is activated. This is your frontal lobe. This is the executive part of the brain. However, when the mind is wandering, a much more diffuse network of regions is activated. This has been called the default mode network. Default mode because that's what the brain defaults to when you're sitting in the doctor's office waiting. So we have very discretely different areas of the brain. So the more time you spend here, the more brain plasticity and brain activity is going to change in that direction, away from a lot of the negative content of mind wandering. So this is explaining why these practices, these contemplative practices, are so good at reducing stress and improving your response to emotions, your reactivity to emotions. And just to give you an example of one research study, here we are at the Brahma Kumaris Center. I thought I'd show you a Brahma Kumaris research study. This was a study looking at the effects of Brahma Kumaris meditation on stress variables on the autonomic nervous system. And they compared long-term practitioners with short-term practitioners in terms of the changes in heart rate, blood pressure. And we see statistically significant differences after meditation. And the long-term practitioners are getting deeper reductions in arousal and psychophysiological arousal, reducing heart rate, reducing sympathetic drive, reducing essentially the stress response. And in another study, looking at a higher level function, they examined happiness. And they compared meditators and non-meditators. Meditators' happiness scores were greater, and fewer of the meditators were unhappy compared to the non-meditators. So this actually manifests in changes in mood and in changes even in deeper things, in deeper experiences. Now, speaking of deeper experiences, I like to think about these practices on a temporal frame. So over the short term, you have an immediate change in arousal reduction, physical, mental well-being. This can happen after a few minutes of slow breathing or meditation. You feel quiet, you calm down. Everybody knows that. And then when you practice over the course of weeks and months, you start to develop skills. Brain plasticity, learning starts to take place. You develop a higher mind-body awareness because you're focusing your attention. The more you focus your attention, the more mindful and aware you become. That also leads to this state of resilience to stress. This is this whole construct of self-regulation. You become more in control. You become less emotionally reactive, less stress reactive. You feel better. And a lot of people, this is why they go to yoga practice on a regular basis. What I think happens over the longer term, and we're talking months and years for most people, is that you start to experience deeper experiences, contemplative experiences. And this causes a psychological and philosophical transformation in many people. I've heard many people say this exact phrase, yoga changed my life. And what do they mean by that? They mean that they had a perspective through these practices that's changed their current view of the world and who they are and what their goal is in it. And I think this comes from these deeper experiences that happen during the contemplative practice. These brief unitive experiences of peace and joy and flow and harmony. These are remarkable experiences that people have never had. And when you first experience these kinds of things, it just changes your world perspective. And you start to change your goals, you start to change your values, all in a positive direction. You no longer are as materialistic and interested in a lot of these temporary types of goals. Your goals are much more internal and deeper. So I think these practices over the long term have a real, as I would say, spiritual component to them, to be able to do this kind of transformative change. Now, we have the least amount of evidence for this kind of change. However, I'm going to share a little bit that we do have. This is from one study that we conducted in long-term yoga practitioners. And what we asked them was, how much of an experience of this transcendence are you experiencing? And the experience of transcendence was directly correlated with how much time and how often they were practicing yoga. So I believe we can do the research that shows that people have more transcendence in their lives the more they practice. And in another study, we took music performers who often experience this unitive state in their music performance. There's this sense of oneness, a sense of, this construct is called flow, the sense of unity with the instrument. There's no division between you and the instrument and the music. There's a sense of timelessness. There's a sense of unitive expansion. It's a very profound and deep experience. And musicians really love this because that's why they practice music to a large degree. And what we did in this study was we took two groups and we gave one group 6 weeks of yoga. And we measured their flow through this questionnaire. And we found that their flow experience was increased. So we can actually measure and increase this transcendent experience. And a subscale of this questionnaire is called autotelic experience, which is essentially this unitive experience. So I believe that we can do this research and show that yoga can have profound effects on people's values, goals, and life direction. So now I want to summarize everything I've said up to now. If you take nothing else, this is the summary slide. This is a logic model that sort of explains a lot and summarizes a lot of what I've said about the psychophysiology. So yoga is, again, we're talking about this multi-component practice. One thing it does, of course, and I haven't shown you this data, but it's very obvious that yoga increases flexibility, muscular strength, coordination, balance, respiratory function through the pranayama exercises, and this leads to a self-efficacy of your body, or more control of your body. And a mind-body connection means that it's not just your body, you're affecting the rest of the things too, because you can't separate the mind and the body. I've talked about self-regulation improving, and that includes emotion regulation and stress regulation, which leads to the skills of resilience to stress and equanimity in the face of emotions. You're no longer as emotionally reactive. And that leads to a self-efficacy of emotional and cognitive functioning. I've talked about focusing your attention and awareness. You're increasing your ability to control your attention. That leads to an increase in mindfulness, increase of mind-body awareness, increases in your cognitive activity, your concentration, and what we call metacognition, the ability to step back and watch the flow of thought and not get caught up in it. This is a very important component of meditation practice. And then finally, I've ended with spirituality, these experiences of transcendence, this unitive state, the experience of flow, which causes a life transformation and a change in life meaning and purpose in a positive direction. So altogether, these things are all working together. In fact, they're interactive. That's what these arrows are for. These things are not separate. They're all interacting. And then ultimately, that leads to global human functionality on many levels. Physical and mental health, physical, mental, and emotional performance, positive behavior change, and then higher level changes, social responsibility, values and relationships, increase in quality of life, ultimately life purpose and meaning, and even spirituality. So this is how we're starting to see the evidence really amount to these kinds of global changes. Because there's multi-component practices, there's multi-component changes. So now let's go forward into the research realm, into the therapy realm. And where are we with yoga as a therapeutic intervention for patient populations? Well, we just published this paper last year. This was a review of all the clinical trial publications of yoga as a therapeutic intervention for for some kind of medical disorder, whether psychiatric or physical. And now you can see that this research really didn't begin until very recently. In fact, the first studies that were published on yoga therapy were done in the UK. Chandra Patel published studies on yoga for hypertension. One of those studies in Lancet, but way back in the 70s. So it's a really recent field, but look at this change. This is the purple. This is the total number of publications. And look at the change over the past 10 years. This is dramatic and actually reminiscent of what we see in terms of the public's practice of yoga. Both of these things are sort of taking off like rockets. And it's not just the quantity, and there's now about 500 studies that have been published, which sounds like a lot, but in modern medicine, 500 studies is a drop in the bucket. So we've got a long way to go, but nevertheless, it's 500 more studies than we had, 20, 30 years ago. It's not just the quantity that's increasing. These, in the orange trace here, this is the randomized controlled trials. These are the very rigorous types of research designs. And so not only is the quantity of yoga research increasing, the quality of this work is also improving. Now, again, this body of research is growing, so we now have clinical trials on a lot of studies that have been done. So now we're seeing review papers. There's review papers on yoga for hypertension, reviewing all the studies that have been published in that area. Yoga for depression, yoga for anxiety, yoga for diabetes, yoga for obesity, and on it goes. So we're seeing publication of all of those. And what we published a few years ago was actually a review of reviews. So we're starting to build this pyramid of biomedical research evidence for the efficacy of yoga in a wide variety of conditions. And this level of evidence has grown to the extent that in the United States, we're now holding our 5th Symposium on Yoga Research. We bring together yoga researchers in a single venue for 3 days to share their research findings, to develop collaborations, and share information. And the next one is happening in September at the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, which is the largest yoga center in the United States. This body of research has also justified a just published medical textbook called The Principles and Practice of Yoga and Healthcare. And I served as the chief editor of this. I was joined by leaders in the field as co-editors. This is a medical textbook written in a medical format. There are 90 contributors to this textbook. 60 of them are the leading yoga researchers across the world who have contributed chapters on yoga, summarizing the rationale, summarizing the research and the practice of yoga for a variety of different conditions. In addition to that, we included also 30 yoga therapists who provided practical recommendations or counterindications for a number of different conditions. So we're hoping, this is the first of its kind, and we're hoping that this textbook serves as an introduction of yoga to the modern medical system. It's written in modern scientific language in a conservative, rigorous way that modern medicine can appreciate. So we're hoping that this makes a difference. And for those of you who have some interest in a textbook like this, I put some cards out on the table, and you're welcome to take those cards. This is available from the publisher, who incidentally is a UK publisher, Handspring Publishing. This body, so just to give you an example, I mean, ordinarily I show research that I've done on yoga clinical trials, but being here at the BK Center, I thought I'd show you some Brahmakumaris studies. So this is a Brahmakumaris meditation study for headache. And in this table here, you can see that there's group 1, which is the Brahmakumaris technique, and a control group. And you can see severity of headaches are dropping from 5.9 to 1.1. The control group dropped from 5.8 to 4.7. So the Brahmakumaris technique is working much more effectively, not only in headache severity, but in frequency, duration of the headache episodes, and even a phenomenon called, or a measure called the headache index. In fact, there's also decreases in depression and anxiety score. And one of the features of this is that although you're treating headache, instead of negative side effects, you get positive side effects, because then you also get reductions in depression and anxiety. So it's not like pills where you take the pill, it works on one thing, and then you get side effects. In yoga, you take the yoga, you cure what you help fix what you're trying to fix, but then you get positive side effects. So there's a beauty to this that is just really remarkable. Now, we can always talk about yoga for treating disease that already exists. And that's what modern medicine is really good at. The problem is that we are now facing an epidemic. And it's an epidemic of so-called lifestyle or non-communicable disease. Non-communicable diseases, or these preventable lifestyle diseases, are the leading cause of death in the world at the moment. The leading cause of death in the world. In most middle and high-income countries, NCDs are responsible for more deaths than all other causes of death combined. NCD deaths are also projected to increase by 15% globally between 2010 and 2020. What are these diseases? Diabetes, obesity, hypertension, depression. What do these come from? They come from lifestyle risk factors, largely things like inactivity, inadequate physical activity, poor dietary choices, smoking, drinking, poor nutritive choices. So these are preventable. And the problem is to try and find how we can stop these diseases from coming to the fore. Modern medicine is unfortunately focused on treatment of symptoms. So they're trying to find the pill that cures diabetes. They're trying to find the pill that cures obesity, despite the fact that the underlying causes of these diseases are behavioral. These are lifestyle issues. And you cannot, in my opinion, treat an epidemic of diabetes with a pill. It's not going to work. The problem is modern medicine is enamored with high tech. Every scientist wants to win the Nobel Prize for the pill that will cure cancer. And then when they come to the idea of prevention, in which you have to deal with people and their stresses and their behaviors, well, that's messy. It's not clean. Nobody's going to win a Nobel Prize for prevention. So prevention gets short shift. And the focus is on treatment of symptoms, which are very expensive. And so that's why the healthcare system is so expensive, so overburdened, and why it's not actually successful. So the real challenge is to put more energy into prevention. And there are three factors in preventing NCD's lifestyle diseases that I think yoga is particularly good at. One I've already talked about, and that is stress. As a society, we don't have any strategies for managing stress. I never learned anything in high school or in public school. I never learned anything in university. They're not part of our system. They're not even part of the medical system. In fact, it's the teachers and the doctors who are under the most stress. So we don't have these strategies. We need them. Yoga is exactly such a strategy. Another factor is mind-body awareness. As a society, essentially, we are numb. We are numb to our minds and our bodies. We don't even know what's going on in our own bodies. We're not sensitive to them. If we were more sensitive, if we had more mind-body awareness, we would be more sensitive of what we're doing to ourselves and how it feels, and we would adjust our behavior accordingly. And that is a big factor. And yoga is very good at increasing mind-body awareness, which can lead to behavior changes from the bottom up. And then finally, there's the worldview aspect. And this comes from this transcendence, this transformation phenomenon. I think predominantly Western society, well, modern society as a whole, is essentially still a rat race. The ultimate goals for most people are materialistic. It's monetary, to have a 3-car garage. It's power, it's fame. That's what leads people. That's what their goals are. And we know that those goals are not satisfying. They do not lead to happiness. They do not lead to life satisfaction. So how do you change that? You change that by giving people a deeper experience of what it really means to be a human being and experience the highest levels of what it is to be a human being. And that is this unitive state, this spiritual consciousness. And so yoga can provide that kind of transformation and change those values. Those values are really responsible for a lot of the greed and violence in the planet. So I view yoga as able to address these three major components that underlie the risk factors for a lifestyle disease, which are so dominant in modern society. So, does yoga work? Well, we do have some evidence that yoga practitioners are healthier. So this is from a study done at our National Institutes of Health. Yoga practitioners rate their health as either excellent or very good. Most of them have never smoked or have quit smoking, and most of them have moderate or high levels of physical activity. So they're already adopting and engaging in positive behaviors. In terms of mental health, just focus your attention on this last graph. 43.8% of yoga practitioners rate their mental health as flourishing. Only 21% of the general public rates themselves that way. So mental health is definitely in favor of those people who practice yoga over the long term. Not only do people report that their health is better, both mentally and physically, they attribute that improvement in health to the yoga practice. So in answer to the question, my health has improved because of yoga, 89.5% of long-term yoga practitioners strongly agree with that statement. In terms of my relationships with others are better, 67%. I am happier because of yoga, 86.5%. So they attribute these improvements in their life and their health and in their state of being to the yoga practice. Now you could argue that, okay, well, this is all long-term yoga practitioners. Well, yoga practitioners are weird in the first place. That's who they are. They're practicing yoga because they're weird. And you're not studying the yoga, you're studying the weirdness. They were healthy to start with, and now they're healthy, and so you're not really showing us anything. So what's the answer to that? Well, scientifically, what you want to do is what's called a prospective study. You take a bunch of people who have never practiced yoga, give them yoga, and see what happens. And if you do that over a bunch of years, you'll really see whether they really do or do not develop diseases, and those kinds of studies need to be done. But this is a short-term study that gives you a glimpse of what we can see. So this was a randomized controlled trial of two groups. One group got yoga, the other didn't. What they measured was their levels of physical activity. Not just yoga, but any physical activity. And as you can see here, the yoga group has increased their levels of physical activity. The other group has remained unchanged. And the researchers attributed this to the acute feeling responses to the yoga classes, which have been favorable and have increased adherence to the physical because they have better physical self-efficacy. But another point here, which is really critical for me, is the participants reported an increased self-awareness as a result of their experience. They practice yoga, they become more aware of their body, they do a physical activity, and they say, wow, I really like that. I feel that in my body. I never used to feel it that way. Now I feel it, I want to do more exercise. The same is true with nutrition and all other positive behaviors. When you become more mind-body aware, you gravitate towards positive behaviors because you know they make you feel better, and you gravitate away from negative behaviors because they don't feel good. This is behavior change from the bottom up, which is beautiful because modern medicine is using the top down. Patient goes to the doctor with diabetes, he gets a recommendation to change his life this way, that way, goes home and fails. There's no support for a real fundamental change to adopt a new lifestyle. So this is critical. And I want to finish very quickly with the best place for preventive medicine, and that's in our children and education. We have huge problems in our adolescent and child populations. I don't have time to give you all of the data, but it's true here in the UK as well. This is from a 2014 report. The absolute levels of most of the health outcome indicators for young people remain too high. Particularly in comparison with similar high-income countries, many trends need to come down further, and some need to be reversed. There are a huge number of problems. A lot of them stem from stress, which leads to behavior, mental health problems, attention problems, academic problems, and physical health. You know, it's remarkable that we have unprecedented levels of obesity in our children these days. And these are due to these lifestyle factors. We're not giving the kids the tools to self-regulate, to be mind-body aware. So we have focused on this in my laboratory. We've published this paper, which is a scientific rationale for why yoga belongs in the public schools. Our goal in my laboratory is to conduct research that shows that yoga in public schools can make fundamental changes that will improve health. And this is also supported by an organization called the Yoga Service Council, which has published this book, Best Practices for Yoga in Schools, which describes how you can apply yoga in the school setting effectively. And I'm here in London, in fact, primarily to attend this conference called the Instill Conference, which is focused on yoga in education. This is the second conference of its time. 100 people go to SOAS through this meeting on Friday and Saturday, and we'll be talking about how yoga can be implemented in schools and the results of the research that's been done. In the United States, we've held the Yoga in Schools Symposium, which brings together these programs and the researchers to show the effectiveness of yoga in schools. And in my lab, we've published this paper recently, which has summarized the movement in the US of these programs implementing yoga in schools. In fact, there are about 36 of these programs implementing programs in almost 1,000 schools, and they've trained almost 6,000 instructors. So this is a grassroots movement. Although it's very small, it's growing. The other thing we've done is published a research review of all of the publications that have looked at research on yoga in the public schools. And again, we see this dramatic trend over the past 10 years, not just in the quantity here, but also in the randomized control trials, the quality. And the outcomes we're finding in these studies are the same outcomes you get in adults: stress coping, self-regulation, emotional arousal, aggression, hostility, mood, self-esteem, behavior changes. The kids benefit in the same way the adults do. It works for kids, so it belongs in the schools. That's our argument. And in fact, this is data from a number of our studies summarizing the changes we've seen over a single semester. The pink is the yoga group. No changes over time, no worsening and improvement. But look at the control group. This is this change, this is the deterioration in mental health we're seeing in our kids. And yoga is acting as a preventive break. And we've seen the same thing in a recent study we conducted with substance abuse risk factors. This was the willingness to smoke cigarettes. This was the control group. It got much worse. The yoga group pretty much held its own. So yoga can act as a preventive break on the development of these risk factors for lifestyle disease and these negative behaviors. And I'm going to end with this study here, which is actually interviewing the kids and asking them, what kind of changes did you go through with the yoga intervention? And I've grouped these results in terms of those risk factors that I've talked about. And there you go. So in terms of stress, one student said, I use breathing outside the classroom in my life to calm me down. If I was stressed or angry, I'd then do the breathing to calm me down, and I will probably continue to do this. This child has learned a new behavioral technique, and that is there for the rest of his or her life, and they can use it for free. And it's likely to change their life trajectory in terms of lifestyle disease. In terms of body awareness, one student said, I learned how to pay attention to how my body feels. This is the core of the experience of increasing mind-body awareness. And then, as a consequence of that, another student said, I've been eating healthier, more fruits and vegetables, and not a lot of junk food, for example, ice cream and candy. We didn't give them nutritional recommendations. This came out of the mind-body awareness. They gravitated towards a better diet because now they can feel better when they eat the proper food. And then finally, worldview. I've been a lot more happier lately. I feel like a better person making choices and staying out of trouble. We're changing their executive function, their perception of who they are. And then we've also run this study and run these yoga classes in one school for a number of years. And this is a quote from the school counselor. Yoga has made a huge impact on our school. It is making our school a better place. As you change the individual, you change the group. As you change the group, you change society ultimately. If you can teach yoga in all of the schools for 3 generations, the entire population will have these skills. This is the goal of our research, to provide the research evidence that justifies that policy implementation of inserting yoga into the public schools and into our medical systems. So I'm indebted to the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, which has funded my research for a substantial degree over the past 15 years. I'm also indebted to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which funded that last study on willingness to smoke cigarettes. And I'm also have been funded in the Yoga in Schools research by the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, particularly the Kripalu Institute for Extraordinary Living. This is the largest yoga center in the United States, and they're dedicated to moving yoga forward into the professional real world. And then finally, I'm also indebted to the Kundalini Research Institute, which supports my research on yoga in general. And I had one last slide, but it's not there, so thank you for your attention.
The evidence and the power of all the benefits that yoga brings, so thank you. I'd now like to invite Sister Maureen to come on stage. And Sister Maureen will be sharing with us. Sister Maureen is a practicing meditator and a practitioner and a teacher. Raj Yoga meditation is taught here at the Brahma Kumaris for the past 40 years. And she is going to respond to Professor Khalsa's incredible presentation and also share with us the benefits of Raj Yoga meditation. So when we've just set up, we'd love you both to come back on stage. Thank you.
Good evening to everyone. And many of you know our greeting of Om Shanti, I am peace. Thank you, Professor Khalsa. That was very, very fascinating, and I just whispered to him, how do you follow that? And he said, well, the practice has to follow the theory, but it wasn't just theory. Very, very real information, and very fascinating and very important. It's so important that these things are backed up by science, because then, for many people, okay, then it must be true. And I'm glad you included a few BK studies in there, so then I don't have any statistics, so you provided them for me, thank you. I found a lot of it very fascinating, and in particular, the part where you were describing the plasticity of the brain. I really thought about Daddy Janki, who many of you know, and she's currently the head of the organization worldwide, 100 years old, and her brain just functions amazingly well. In fact, at one point, she's been through a number of illnesses, and she actually seems to have an ability to regenerate herself. To me, it looks like she does it somehow at the molecular level, actually. I have to say that, because she is really on the brink of leaving us, and you think that's it. And the last bout of serious illness was just in May. And we thought, well, okay, maybe this is it, because when you're 100 years old, how long are you going to go on? And now she's much stronger, she's giving classes, she's back to her routine. How does she do it? And it really is, of course, the practice of meditation, Raj Yoga meditation. And I remember a few years back that one of the doctors who was looking at her, examining her physically, said, Daddy, there is something wrong with all of your organs somewhere, but your brain, perfect. And in fact, in 1978, she was tested at the, Texas, somewhere in Texas, I've forgotten, some research institute, Wired Up, as you saw those yogis on the slide. And through cognitive tasks that she was given to do, she was exhibiting delta waves, which is, the waves you usually have during deep sleep. And in fact, they said to her, yours is the most stable mind that we've ever tested. And then for years we had, people kept saying she's the most stable mind in the world. That's not what they said. It might be true, but that's not what they said. But the most stable mind they'd ever tested. So she's a kind of living proof of that, of course, and many of our practitioners, and also in my own experience, the changes that I've experienced in my life and my lifestyle have been incredible over the last 40 years now. And yes, the practice that we do is Raj Yoga meditation. And it was interesting that you were, coming to that point where it's really that art of self-mastery, that art of self-awareness internally that helps us to regulate everything else in our lives, including the health of the body and the functioning of the body. And I like this term you use, metacognition, which really made me think of self-awareness, because in the being of the self, or the spiritual being, we use the term soul, that's the being that is observing what's happening in the consciousness, what's happening in the mind. And so there's this interface, which is very interesting, between the consciousness, the mind, and then the physical matter. And that's really what you've been studying in depth. And of course, in Raj Yoga, we have 4 subjects that we study that make up our whole lifestyle, our whole way of living. Because as Sat Bir said, it's of course not a question just of a practice or an exercise, it's a whole way of life. And the 4 subjects that we have, first of all, we say knowledge or spiritual teaching. Because if I'm going to practice something, I need the groundwork, or I need the foundation of understanding. Because when I understand something well, in other words, I understand about the nature of the self, the nature of the divine, the nature of what's happening in the world, then with that understanding, I'm able to have a basis for my practice, which is why we study teachings every day, which I'm sure you do too. And then from that understanding comes the practice of the connection. So Raj Yoga, one, you can interpret it as mastery over the self, the Raja, the king, the sovereign. The other is that connection with the highest, with the source. And that's very important for us because it creates that flow of spiritual energy, that flow of divine energy from the source to the self, of course to our physical bodies, into our relationships, into the world. And whatever is happening within the self, I think we're all very aware of, creates an atmosphere around us which has an impact on everything else. We all emit vibrations all the time which create an atmosphere. So the study, the connection, the strengthening of the inner being, the strengthening of the soul within. And, you know, what I found, I think about myself, I could say I was one of the most undisciplined people. I liked to sleep all hours of the day. I was very untidy. And when I started to practice Raj Yoga meditation, it was like a cure, I think, for me, for my ailments. I began to get discipline in my life that I just never had. And that was because of that strengthening within. And that self-discipline also increases your self-esteem and all the other effects that we were seeing. So this flow of energy, I feel, is very critical, very important. And that comes into the third subject then of what we call dharana, or the imbibing of virtues. So in a way, what is your attitude, you know, the increasing positivity that we were seeing on the graph, rather than the negativity, the focus and concentration rather than the wandering of the mind. And all of this comes through the practice of yoga and the conscious attention or to actually practice what we call virtues in life, powers in life. Do I have the power of discernment? Do I have clarity? Am I able to have tolerance, give respect to others? All of these aspects which come into our lifestyle of how we live based on the practice of yoga. So yoga transforming how we live. And then, and of course included in that is our lifestyle aspects such as a vegetarian diet and, you know, being more aware of what is good for the body and good for my health. And we're all very individual in that. And I think for myself, over the last few years, that awareness has heightened for me. And I personally have made a number of changes in my diet particularly. And then the fourth aspect that we have is seva or service. And again, I don't have statistics, but I know there are studies that show that people have a greater sense of well-being when they're serving others, when they're giving to others. So their life is not just lived in a selfish or self-centered way, inward-looking way, but when there is the service of others and the consideration of the needs of others, it actually creates a greater sense of happiness and well-being within. And so these are the four subjects that we study in Raj Yoga. And I think this relates very much to the points you were making about reduction of stress, greater self-awareness, and changing your worldview, because particularly when you decide that, yes, I would like my life to be of service to others and even of service to the world, then your worldview definitely changes 360 degrees. in a very powerful and beneficial way. And so I think, we're just on the same page, really, that how through the various practices we come to that sense of our spiritual selves. And in our world today, there's a lack of spirituality. It really is a huge need. The living from the inside out rather than the outside in. And so I hope that what we've all learnt this evening and looked at will help to underline and confirm that practice for all of us. Thank you very much. Om Shanti. Thank you again. Thank you.
Sharing with us the tenets of Raj Yoga and how it connects in with what Professor Khalsa has also been sharing on many other forms of yoga as well. So before we're going to have some questions, we just thought it'd be nice just to have a few moments reflection on what we've been listening to. So just a few moments of silence, just to think to yourself, what has touched your heart from what you've heard this evening? What has resonated with you? Thank you. Now, we do have a roving mic, so if there are any questions for our speakers, please do raise your hand and the mic will come to you. Any questions? Yeah, thank you.
Just a comment.
One moment, the mic's coming.
Just a comment. I believe, and I'm sure most of the Raj Kumaris would agree with me, that what we are trying to achieve with yoga, we are doing this with yoga, we are doing this with Raj Yoga and more.
Yes, yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is a contemplative, Brahma Kumaris, Raja Yoga meditation is a contemplative practice. And so you achieve all of the benefits of that practice. I think there is virtue in adding the physical components.
Would you be interested in Raj Yoga?
I'm interested in all forms of yoga.
I think you have a lot to gain.
Sorry? I think there is a lot of, complementarity between all the different forms of yoga, and I think that's very important to keep in mind.
I was just wondering, have you found any difference between the different types of yoga? Because there's so many types of yoga now. Are there any that affects your body system in more in one way than another?
You know, we don't have the research in that at this point in time. The research that's been conducted so far in yoga, and as you say, there are many different styles, and in fact, the research is done on many different styles. The most of the research that's being done now is answering one one of the most basic fundamental questions, and that question is, does yoga do anything at all? That's our research question right now. Show me the proof. That's where the research funding is going, and that's where the people are doing the research. The more fine-tuned questions, like which style is doing more of what, and how much yoga do you need to practice, those are more subtle but important questions in research, and we're not there yet. We're still funding the basic questions of research. Undoubtedly, I do believe that there will be differences in the different styles, and those differences will come from the different emphases in these different styles. For those of you that know yoga practices, you'll know that Iyengar yoga is particularly focused on physical postures and alignment. The style that I practice, Kundalini Yoga, is much more focused on mantra, breath work, and meditation. And so you're going to see different emphases in these different styles of yoga, and they're going to make different changes in different ways. And so it may be in the future that, a physical form of yoga might be more appropriate for some kind of physical imbalance, whereas mental imbalances may be more effectively treated with yoga styles that focus more on meditation and breathing. But we don't know the answers to that yet. And certainly there are what I call very limited forms of yoga. There's a lot of yoga out there that's being taught that is nothing but postures. And the focus is simply on becoming slim or actually trivial goals. There's no meditation, there's no relaxation, there's no breathing techniques even. They're there just to get slim and look good. I call this butt slimming yoga. Now, many people get upset with that, especially in India. They say, oh, you Americans, you guys are taking our sacred practices and you're doing these trivial things with them. How dare you? And they get very upset because they believe that Americans are trivializing yoga. Well, certainly there are these limited forms of yoga, but the traditional forms of yoga practice, the holistic practices, are not going anywhere. They're not going away. In fact, I believe that the trivial forms of yoga, the limited forms of yoga, are a gateway to the deeper practices. Because these asanas are different. They focus more on stretching, they focus more on holding the postures, on balance, on coordination, and they give you more of a relaxation effect than Western aerobic exercises like jogging. And so people will experience those deeper changes just with the asanas. And then when they say, wow, that's a great experience, I want more of that, I'm not getting it anymore just with the asanas, then they'll go across the street to the studio that's doing the traditional yoga practice. So for me, it's a positive. People are better doing these asanas than they are doing jogging. And ultimately, if they keep on practicing, they will transition most likely into a deeper form of yoga practice. So it's all good.
There is one more.
When did yoga start?
Yoga started a long time ago. We have the strongest evidence for the origin of yoga is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which, the date varies, but maybe 500 BCE is the latest. The other finding is that there was a civilization called the Indus Valley Civilization in the Indus Valley, which is somewhat mostly in Pakistan, but some in India. This civilization ended 1500 BCE and probably was 2,000 years running. There are artifacts from that civilization that show this meditative posture. And so, we don't know the language. There's a script, but we haven't deciphered it. So it is possible that this civilization did these kinds of practices, and that would make yoga anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 years old. So it depends, but it's definitely very old.
So I just want to come with something there. Is it right that yoga was mostly practiced by men until very recently?
I would say that historically, yoga was sort of a secret practice, if anything. It was practiced in ashrams, in groups, in many cases in secret. And over the history, dogmatic religions have have suppressed these kinds of contemplative practices in many societies. I mean, even recently, I mean, when, the communist era was there, the communist regime suppressed any kind of religious or, expression in behind the Iron Curtain. So, for example, my colleague in Poland, they had to practice yoga in secret in the 1970s because the communist regime refused to allow it. So it has varied over history, but most of the time, and we don't have a written history in India. That's the problem with Indian history. There's not a lot of writings. So all we have is sort of stories, and some of these are questionable. So, it's unlikely that it was practiced worldwide, but who knows, in this Indus Valley civilization, maybe it was a large practice. One of the unique factors on this Indian civilization is that they had no evidence of forts or weapons of any kind.
Yeah.
So maybe there was a utopia at that point in time that practiced these contemplative practices. We can only imagine.
Thank you for all lovely and brilliant information you gave this evening to us. And it's really good to know that you're serving at such a prestigious uni, in Harvard, basically, and doing so much. Just my question that you said, you yourself practice so many different types of yoga and elements of yoga, and myself particularly was also interested to know, and if you can reflect on Kundalini, it'd be great.
So Kundalini Yoga is a broad term, and there are a number of different styles of what people practice as Kundalini. One of the goals of some styles of Kundalini Yoga is to raise the Kundalini energy up the spine to bring to fore the experience of higher consciousness. The Kundalini Yoga I practice is actually called Kundalini Yoga as taught by Yogi Bhajan. It's a very specific style of yoga. The goal is not as much to have the Kundalini experience. The goal is to raise your consciousness in a steady, progressive way to increase your level of consciousness, to increase your awareness, to increase your control, your self-regulation. This has been practiced since the early 1970s. It's quite popular in the US. It's now having growing popularity in South America, in China, and then also in Europe, and certainly there are Kundalini Yoga practitioners here in the UK as well.
Recently, earlier this year, I attended a workshop, a 5-day workshop, and I think it's with you. Is that right?
No, I wasn't here. No.
No, okay. Would you be offering any courses at all to us?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Would you be offering courses on that?
From time to time I have given workshops, but primarily these days my focus is really on education and research. So the research part is three areas really. Research, I am involved in research trials and conducting research trials in my laboratory. So we have trials ongoing for yoga for generalized anxiety disorder, yoga for post-traumatic stress disorder, yoga in schools. So I'm actively involved in the research studies themselves. The other area I'm involved in is essentially at a higher level of policy. So I conduct symposia on yoga research. This book was a major effort in terms of policy to move yoga therapy into healthcare. I'm very much involved in the policy involved in yoga into education, so I'm publishing review papers and position papers that argue for the implementation of yoga in society in a broader way. And then finally, I do education. So I do public talks, I do talks to symposia and so on and so forth to educate the public and the scientific community about the evidence that we have for yoga and how this is a credible practice that has real results, that can have a real solid place in terms of the practice of everyday individuals and extreme value in the implementation in the schools and in the medical system. So I'm doing a lot of this kind of seminar work, which I consider as a form of education work. And so, as a consequence, I have little time for actually teaching yoga itself.
Yeah, we've got a little time left now too. So time maybe just for one more question. Has anyone got a
There's somebody in the front.
Someone.
behind you.
Behind you there.
First of all, I'm really pleased to see you, Mr. Khalsa, and Sister Maureen together, because I think we can't do physical yoga without the Raj Yoga. I try to, I actually belong to Sikh religion from the beginning. I try to understand, because if we see the Japji Sahib, the last 44 bodies, Karam Khand and Gyan Khand and Dharam Khand, is all says what we learn from here. But before I came here, I wasn't absorbing anything because I was full of anger and a bit of ego and stress, and you can name all the negative things. But since I started this university, it has transformed me so much because I'm much better Sikh now. I do know actually President Singh Puri because my friend, he's relative to her, and I read about him deeply about your all this and stuff. But I just congratulate Sister Maureen because I always wanted to see you two together because there's so much similarity.
You don't know how you fulfill people's...
Without the Raj Yoga, you cannot do the physical yoga. Because I've gone to the classes, if the teacher says turn left or say deep breath. If people have stress or negative or jealousy or revenge inside, and you were talking about the research. I think I've been coming here for the last 15 years, and I've done so much observation and on myself. I suffered with medical condition, which has improved without any medicine. But I do physical yoga, and I do study about your H3 or whatever it's called. I think two together will work much better.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so is there one last question that needs? Yeah, just is it a quickie?
Yeah,
lovely.
Question.
Okay.
I just wanted to know if this change in perception in the US society is just for yoga or also for other alternative medicine like Reiki or any energy healing or anything. And the second one is just the other people like the pill or the health industry as such, how has been their reaction? Is it just ambivalent or hostile? How do you find it? Is it changing?
So the yoga and in fact meditation, mindfulness, all of these practices are part of a larger movement of integrative medicine. And there in fact is an organization called the Academic Consortium for Integrative Medicine and Health, which is a leading organization that represents the whole field of integrative medicine, not just yoga and meditation, but all of mind-body medicine and all of other traditional medicines, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, acupuncture, etc., etc. So this is a whole movement in integrative medicine that is running in the United States and across the world for that matter. And this organization holds large conferences, the largest conference in the world, which was just held last May, 800 scientists showing up to share this field and move this field forward. So yoga is much a part of a much broader movement of integrative medicine. In terms of your next question was?
Yeah, the non-believers, how?
Oh yes. So, people ask me, well, are the pharmaceutical companies trying to suppress you? No, there's no such conspiracy. This is, this is make-believe. There's no such movement, nor could there be such a movement. The pharmaceutical company people are people. They suffer too. They know that the drugs can't help them either. So this is a real practice. There's no way that you can suppress this. And nor would you want to suppress it. It's not a credible threat. I think that if I was to say, is there a limitation that we face in moving yoga and yoga research forward, that is not one of them. The other thing that's not one of them is the academic community is not saying, oh, you can't do this at Harvard Medical School. No, that's not there either. The only limitation we face is funding for the research. That is the only limitation. And it is very difficult to get funding from our governmental agencies to support this research. And so we write 10 grants, we maybe get one, and the rest go in the garbage. So it's a lot of work to try and keep ourselves funded. That is the biggest challenge. There is a support that on some occasions where individuals who are wealthy have supported this research. And so we are very open to that kind of funding from wealthy individuals. There are people who are wealthy who have benefited from yoga. They have an opportunity to give back. So if you know of any wealthy people, send them here.
I'm sorry, I don't have any pockets in this one.
On that note, I'd like to, before we close, I'd just like to invite Sister Maureen to share reflective meditation, so have a look at some practice of Raja Yoga together.
Thank you. So please sit comfortably, feet on the floor. Take a couple of deep breaths. So that you're relaxed, comfortable. And we reflect on the nature of our thoughts. I watch my thoughts. Are they focused? Are they distracted, wandering? Am I able to bring my thoughts into focus? So that I can go on an inward journey. Journey to experience the inner being of the self. The being that's non-physical, but yet is working through my physical body. That being is a being of light, of spiritual energy, and the focus for that light is in the center of my forehead, in the control room of the body. But yet, I, the being, am not my body. I have an existence beyond this physical costume of mine. And so I can take my consciousness beyond the limitation of space and time, to connect with the source of being, with the light of the divine. I'm connecting with a source of peace, of love, of wisdom that is unlimited. And I draw that energy into myself. I myself become the form of peace, the form of love, the form of wisdom. My original state of being has awakened. And I'm able to share the vibrations of my being with those around me, and into the atmosphere of the world.